A single second can feel like an infinity when it carries the weight of a life-changing choice and a deep emotion. We capture those eternal moments and turn them into cinematic art for your viewing pleasure every day. Subscribe today and explore the infinite nature of the story.
The banker turned the screen toward me, and I sat completely still. My hands were resting on the edge of the desk, and I could not move them. The number on that screen was larger than anything I had ever seen attached to my name. After everything that had happened, after the courtroom, after the empty apartment, after my daughter stopped returning my calls, I had walked into that branch on Wellington Street with nothing but an old tin box and a folded piece of paper my father had written 41 years ago. And now a stranger in a gray blazer was looking at me like I was someone he needed to be careful around. I need to go back to the beginning, because none of it makes sense unless you understand what I had and what was taken from me, and how it was taken so cleanly that I almost believed I deserved it. My name is Gerald. I turned 63 last March, the same week the divorce was finalized. I spent that birthday alone in a furnished apartment in Hamilton, Ontario, eating reheated soup and watching the freezing rain come down the window. I had been a structural engineer for 31 years. I built my practice from a two-person office above a dry cleaner on Barton Street into a firm with 14 employees and contracts across southern Ontario. I was not flashy about it. I drove the same truck for 11 years. I coached my son's hockey team until he was 15. I thought I was the kind of man who understood what mattered. Her name was Renata. I met her when I was 34, at a conference in Ottawa. She was working in project coordination for a federal infrastructure group, and she was sharp and funny, and she laughed at things I said in a way that made me feel more interesting than I was. We married 2 years later. We had 2 children, our son Thomas, and our daughter Claire. For a long time, I thought we were solid. I thought what we had was real. The first sign that something had shifted came about 4 years before everything fell apart. Renata began spending more time in Toronto for work, or what she described as work. She had moved into consulting by then, working with a firm that handled public-private development projects. She would leave Sunday evening and return Thursday night, and there would be 2 or 3 days a week where she was simply unreachable. I told myself it was the nature of the work. I told myself I trusted her. I had built a career on reading structural load and material stress, and somehow I missed every warning sign in my own home. His name was Derek. He was a partner at a mid-sized commercial law firm in downtown Toronto, and he had been working alongside Renata's consulting group on a series of development contracts. I did not know about him until much later. By the time I found out, he had already been involved in our lives in ways I was only beginning to understand. The first conversation that genuinely frightened me happened on a Tuesday evening in November. Renata came home earlier than expected, and she sat down at the kitchen table without taking off her coat, which she never did. She told me she wanted to talk about the future. She told me she had been doing a lot of thinking. She told me that she felt the two of them, meaning her and me, had grown into different people. I asked her what she meant. She said she meant exactly what she said. I asked her if there was someone else. She looked at me for a moment in a way I could not read, and then she said that the question was not really relevant to what she was trying to say. 3 weeks later, I was served with divorce papers at my office. My assistant brought them in with the morning mail and set them on my desk without knowing what they were, and I sat there looking at them for 20 minutes before I picked up the phone. I called a lawyer I knew socially, a man named Phil, who did mostly real estate work but had referred me to a family lawyer once before. He gave me a name. I called that number and set up an appointment. The family lawyer's name was Sandra, and she was calm and thorough, and she told me that the filing was standard and that I should not panic. She told me that in Ontario, matrimonial property is divided equally, that my business would be assessed, that the process takes time, but the law is clear. I held on to that. The law is clear. What I did not know then, and what took me months to understand, was that Derek had spent the previous 2 years helping Renata structure her consulting income in ways that were very difficult to trace. He had also, through a series of transactions I still do not fully understand, helped her establish a position in 2 of my firm's largest contracts in a way that, on paper, gave her a financial interest in the business itself. He had done this quietly, using documentation that had my signature on it. A signature I had given on papers I had not read carefully enough. papers presented to me as routine administrative matters during a period when I was managing a deadline on a hospital expansion project and was not paying enough attention to anything else. By the time my lawyer received the financial disclosure from Renata's side, the picture that emerged bore almost no resemblance to what I believed our finances looked like. The business valuation came in at a fraction of what I had expected. My equity in our home in Burlington, a house I had put 15 years into, that I had renovated twice with my own hands on weekends, was entangled in a financing arrangement that made a clean division nearly impossible. There was a pension account that had been partially moved. There were assets I could not locate. Sandra told me we could fight it. She told me we needed a forensic accountant. I hired one. His name was Raymond, and he was precise and quiet, and he told me after 3 weeks of review that what had been done was technically legal, or close enough to legal, that contesting it would take years and cost more than it would likely recover. He said it with genuine regret. He said it like a doctor giving a diagnosis. The settlement hearing was in February. I remember the light in the courthouse, that particular flat institutional light that makes everyone look slightly unwell. Renata sat on the other side of the room with Derek beside her, not as her legal counsel, but as a support person, which her actual lawyer had arranged with a casualness that told me it had been planned. She did not look at me once. The judge reviewed the agreed-upon documents. Our home in Burlington would be transferred to Renata. My business, the firm I had spent 3 decades building, was to be sold, and the proceeds divided according to the assessed interests, which left me with less than a third of what I had put into it. My pension was split. The vehicle I used for work was included in the asset pool. By the time the hearing was over, what remained in my name was a modest amount of savings, my personal truck, and the clothes in the master bedroom closet, which Renata had agreed not to contest. I walked out of that courthouse and stood on the steps in the February cold, and I could not remember where I had parked. I stood there for a long time. A man walked past me and said, "Excuse me," and I stepped aside, and I watched him go, and I thought, that man knows exactly where he is going. I had no idea. Thomas was 29 at the time and working in Calgary in the energy sector. He had heard Renata's version of events before he had heard mine, and what he had heard was a story about a father who had been distant and difficult and who had put the business ahead of the family for years. There were things in that story that had enough truth in them. I had worked long hours. I had missed things that I could not simply deny all of it, and that made it harder to defend myself without sounding like I was making excuses. He and I barely spoke for the better part of a year. Claire was 26 and living in Vancouver. She was more careful than Thomas, more measured, but she had also kept her distance. She called me on my birthday in March, which I was grateful for, but the call was short and polite in the way that conversations are when the person calling is not sure what to say. She asked how I was doing, and I told her I was managing, which was mostly true. I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in Hamilton because it was what I could afford, and because I had subcontracted work for a firm there, and I thought proximity might lead to something. I did not have the firm anymore, but I had my license and my experience, and I could still work as an independent consultant. I picked up small contracts. I did inspections. I drove to sites in my truck, and I wrote reports, and I sent invoices, and I watched money come in slowly, just enough to keep things stable. The isolation was the hardest part. I had believed, without quite realizing it, that my identity was wrapped up in the firm in being the person people called when they needed something built correctly, in being responsible for 14 people's livelihoods. When that was gone, I was not sure what remained. I had friends from the industry who checked in sporadically, but the kind of friendship that sustains a person over months of difficulty requires a particular kind of showing up, and most people do not know how to do that. I called my sister Margaret in Fredericton twice a week. She had always been steadier than me, more grounded, less likely to be thrown by things. She listened without trying to fix anything, which was what I needed. She would ask about the work I was doing, ask about the apartment, ask about Thomas and Claire, and she would tell me about her grandchildren and her garden and the weather in New Brunswick, and somehow those conversations made the Hamilton apartment feel less airless. It was Margaret who mentioned the tin box. I had forgotten about it entirely. When our parents died, our father in 2009, our mother in 2014, Margaret and I had sorted through the house in Sudbury together. I had taken a few things, some tools, some photographs, a small tin box that had sat on a shelf in our father's workshop for as long as I could remember. I had taken it without really knowing why, the way you take things when you are grieving, and I had put it in the back of a closet in the Burlington house and not thought about it again. When I left that house, I had taken almost nothing with me, but the tin box had been in a box of tools I had loaded into my truck, and it had come with me to Hamilton without my noticing. Margaret asked me one evening if I had ever opened it. I told her I thought I had, years ago, and that there was nothing in it. She said she had a memory of our father saying something about that box, something about it containing papers, but she could not recall the details. She said it was probably nothing. She said to let her know if there was anything interesting. I found the box that same night, on the shelf in the closet, under a level and a roll of survey tape. It was a standard flat tin, the kind that used to hold tobacco, green with a small amount of rust along one edge. When I pried the lid open, there were 3 things inside: a folded piece of paper, a small key on a plain ring, and a card from a bank, the First Northern Trust branch in Sudbury, with an account number printed on it in faded ink. The folded paper was a letter from my father. It was dated September 1983, which would have made me 22 years old, a year before I graduated from engineering school. I do not know why he wrote it then. Maybe he had been thinking about the future. Maybe he had a sense, the way some people do, that things needed to be put in order. The letter said that he had opened an account in my name at the First Northern Trust branch on Paris Street in Sudbury. He had deposited $40 and asked the bank to hold the account in trust, pending a legal instrument he had prepared with a local solicitor. He wrote that the account was not to be touched by him, by me, or by anyone else until I reached the age of 62, or until I faced a circumstance of serious financial hardship, whichever came first. He wrote that he had made this decision because he had watched his own father lose everything in a business failure in the 1950s, and he had promised himself that no son of his would ever have no ground to stand on. He wrote one more thing. He wrote that the account had been set up with a compound interest arrangement through a credit union partnership, and that by the time I accessed it, the amount would be, in his words, considerably more than what I put in. He wrote it with the careful understatement of an electrician from Sudbury who had spent his life being accurate about things and did not believe in exaggeration. I sat on the edge of my bed in that Hamilton apartment and I read the letter 3 times. I turned the card over in my hand. The key was small and plain, and I had no idea what it was for. I called the First Northern Trust main line the next morning. They had merged with another institution years earlier, but the branch on Paris Street still existed under a different name, and when I explained what I had, the woman on the phone was quiet for a moment, and then said I would need to come in person with identification and the documentation. I drove to Sudbury the following Saturday. The branch manager who met with me was a younger man named Garrett, and when I gave him the account card and the letter and the legal instrument I had found folded behind the letter, he excused himself for a long time. When he came back, he had a woman with him from the main office who had driven over from New Sudbury. She introduced herself as the Regional Trust Administrator. She sat down across from me and she put a printed statement on the desk and she turned it to face me. I looked at the number. I looked at it again. My father had deposited $40 in September of 1983. The compound interest arrangement he had set up through a credit union partnership that had been folded into the bank during a 1997 merger, but whose contractual terms had been preserved and continued to accrue, had been running for 41 years. The legal instrument had been drafted precisely enough that 3 separate institutional transitions had not broken the chain of obligation. The amount now sitting in that account, in my name, was just over $4,300,000. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that. I sat in that chair in a Sudbury bank branch on a gray Saturday morning, and I felt something that I cannot accurately call happiness and cannot accurately call relief. It was something older than either of those things. It was the feeling of ground under my feet after a very long time of standing in water. Garrett asked me if I was all right. I told him I was. I told him I needed a few minutes. I called Margaret from the parking lot. When I told her the number, she was silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, in a voice I had not heard from her since our mother's funeral, "Dad knew. He always knew." I did not touch the money immediately. I want to be clear about this because it matters. I did not make a single transaction for 6 weeks. I went back to Hamilton. I continued my inspection contracts. I thought carefully about what I wanted to do and what I did not want to do and what kind of person I intended to be on the other side of this. During those 6 weeks, I called a lawyer in Toronto named Helen, who had been recommended to me by a former colleague. She was not a family lawyer. She worked in commercial litigation and trust law. I told her everything: the divorce settlement, Derek's role in restructuring the assets, the signatures I had given on documents I had not understood, Raymond's assessment that it was close enough to legal. Helen listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Close enough to legal is not actually legal." She said she needed time to review the documents. She said she would be in touch. 3 weeks later, she called me and told me that what Derek had done in relation to my firm's contracts, specifically the way he had established Renata's financial interest using documentation I had signed, constituted a breach of fiduciary duty in the context of the legal advice he had provided to parties with whom I had a contractual relationship. She said it was not a slam dunk, her words, but it was a legitimate case and it was worth bringing. She said she also wanted to refer the conduct to the Law Society of Ontario, which regulates lawyers in the province, because what she had found suggested a pattern of behavior that went beyond my situation. I told her to proceed. The civil case took 14 months. I will not pretend it was easy. There were depositions and document productions and days when I sat in Helen's boardroom reviewing material that made me feel things I would rather not have felt. There was a period of 3 months where Derek's firm attempted a counter-motion that required me to go back to court in a way I had not expected, and I sat in another courthouse hallway and thought about my father's letter, and I stayed steady. The Law Society investigation ran parallel to the civil case. Derek had, it turned out, done similar things to other clients, not identical, but in the same category. The regulatory process is slow and does not make announcements, but Helen kept me informed as best she could. The civil case was settled before it went to trial. The settlement required confidentiality about the terms, and I will respect that here, except to say that it was meaningful and that it addressed not only the asset valuation issues but the contract interest manipulation that Raymond had identified and been unable to pursue. I will also say that Derek no longer practices law in Ontario. I received a letter from the Law Society confirming the outcome of their proceedings, and I read it sitting at my kitchen table in Hamilton with a cup of coffee. And I thought about what my father would have said about a man who used his professional standing to take from people who trusted him. Thomas called me 8 months into the civil process. He had heard from someone in the industry, I do not know the details, that I was pursuing legal action and that the picture was more complicated than what he had been told. He called on a Sunday evening, and he started the conversation by saying he wanted to hear my side. I told him I appreciated that. I told him what had happened, as straightforwardly as I could, without trying to make him feel badly for the distance he had kept. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I should have asked sooner." We talked for 2 hours that night. We talked about hockey and about his work in Calgary and about a woman he was seeing who he thought might be serious. I told him about Sudbury and about the tin box and about the letter his grandfather had written in 1983. He asked me to read him the letter. I got it from the drawer in the kitchen, and I read it out loud over the phone, and when I got to the part about his great-grandfather losing everything in the 1950s, and my father promising that no son of his would have no ground to stand on, Thomas was quiet in a different way, and I could tell he was moved, and I did not say anything to fill the silence. Claire called 2 weeks after Thomas did. She had spoken with her brother, she said, and she had been thinking about reaching out for a while. She told me that she had always suspected the story she had been given was incomplete, but that she had not known how to say that without knowing what the truth actually was. I told her it was all right. She asked if she could come to Hamilton for a weekend, and I said, "Yes, please. I would like that very much." She came in October. We walked along the waterfront, and we ate dinner at a place near the harbor that she chose. And we talked about her work in Vancouver. She was doing landscape architecture, which I had always thought was exactly the right fit for her. And we talked about her mother, not with anger, but with the particular sad clarity that comes when you have had enough time to understand something difficult. She asked me how I was really doing. I told her the truth, which was that I was better than I had been in a long time, and that the apartment was still small and the weather in Hamilton was still gray, but that I felt like myself again in a way I had not expected to. I have thought many times about what my father was trying to do when he set up that account in 1983. He was not a complicated man. He worked for 36 years as an electrician at the Falconbridge smelter. He kept a vegetable garden. He coached ball hockey at the community center until his knees gave out. He was not the kind of person who gave speeches or made pronouncements. He showed you what he thought by what he did. And what he did, quietly, without telling anyone, was protect me from something he had no way of knowing was coming, because he understood that life can take things from you that you did not expect to lose, and he wanted there to be something left. I have also thought about what I would have done without it. This question matters to me. There was a comment someone left on a video I came across. About a story similar to mine, the commenter asked whether the person would have found forgiveness and peace if the money hadn't been there, or whether the peace was only possible because of the inheritance. It is a fair question, and I have sat with it. I do not think the money gave me the peace. I think the money gave me the time and the stability to pursue justice, which is different from peace. The peace came from somewhere else, from Thomas's phone call, from Claire's visit, from reading my father's letter out loud in the dark of an apartment in Hamilton, from understanding that I was not standing in water anymore. The foundation is something I set up in the spring, after everything was resolved. It works with organizations across Ontario and New Brunswick that provide legal aid and financial counseling to people going through contested divorces who cannot afford adequate representation. I named it after my father. He would have been embarrassed by that, which is exactly why I did it. I still drive the same truck. I still do inspection work, though I have the flexibility now to be more selective about the contracts I take. I have a better apartment, one with a window that faces west, so I get the evening light. Thomas visited in July, and we drove up to Sudbury together and stood outside the house on Regent Street where I grew up, which belongs to someone else now, and we did not say very much, but we stood there for a while before we got back in the truck. There is a shelf in my apartment where I have put 3 things: the tin box, the key, and my father's letter, which I had laminated because I was afraid of what would happen to it over time. Margaret thinks the laminating was excessive. She is probably right. But I am an engineer, and when something matters, you protect it against the conditions that would otherwise degrade it, and you make sure the structure can hold. My father understood that. He understood it 41 years before I needed him to. I have spent a lot of time thinking about how this all unfolded, not just the legal process, not just the settlement, but the whole arc of it. From the Sunday evening Renata sat down at my kitchen table in her coat, to the afternoon, I stood outside my childhood home in Sudbury with Thomas beside me. And what I keep coming back to is this: the outcome was not random. It was the result of choices made over decades by people who thought no one was keeping score. Derek spent years using his professional position to quietly reshape other people's financial lives for his own benefit. He was careful and he was patient, and he believed, I think, that being technically close to legal was the same as being safe. It is not. The Law Society of Ontario does not measure conduct against what someone almost did wrong. It measures it against what a person in that position was actually obligated to do. His career ended not because someone caught him in one dramatic moment, but because a pattern of behavior, documented carefully over time, told a complete story. The choices he made accumulated, they became a record. And that record spoke clearly. Renata made different choices, and I have tried to be fair in how I think about them. She wanted out of the marriage, and she wanted security. And somewhere along the way, she decided that the most efficient path to both of those things was to let Derek do what Derek was willing to do. I do not know at what point she understood fully what was happening. I do know that when you accept the benefit of something, without asking too many questions about how it was obtained, you are not standing outside the action. You are inside it. What I want to say to anyone watching this, anyone who has been where I was, sitting in a furnished apartment trying to figure out what is left, is that integrity is not a feeling. It is a practice. It is the thing you do when you are tired and when it would be easier not to. I kept doing the inspection work. I kept calling Margaret. I kept being honest with Thomas and Claire, even when that honesty was uncomfortable for all of us. I did not do those things because I expected to be rewarded. I did them because they were what remained of me after everything else had been taken, and I was not willing to give those away too. My father understood something that I had to learn the hard way, that what you build for the people you love is not always visible, and it is not always immediate, and it does not always look the way you intended. He put $40 in a bank account in 1983, and he wrote a letter that he probably assumed I would never need to read under these circumstances. He was wrong about the circumstances, but he was right about the principle. He understood that the ground can shift, and that a person who has thought carefully about that in advance can give someone else the footing they need to stand back up. I am standing. Thomas and Claire are in my life. The foundation is running. The truck still starts every morning. That is more than enough.